Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be speaking with Professor Taha Hameduddin about his new study, Leadership and Public Service Motivation, a Systematic Synthesis. All right, well, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I did read the study, and it is very dense to a layman. I did make it all the way through it, and while I was reading it, I understood what I was reading, but then it's a little bit hard to absorb. Um, so,
Yeah, this thankfully the journal that we published in didn't have any word limits. Usually
okay.
there's a 8 to 10,000 word limit, but this one I think it ran maybe 12,000 words just because there
hmm
was so much.
hmm
So yeah, it's a challenge to kind of be faithful to the research, but also try to simplify and make it accessible. So yeah, it's a ongoing challenge.
hmm Well, let's start with just the title, Leadership and Public Service Motivation, a Systematic Synthesis. Can you explain the title to me?
So basically, the idea is there are these two things out there in the world. Leadership, we see it everywhere, right? So if you want to sell a talk or a speaker or a class,
hmm
you have to put the word leadership in it. And everyone signs up because they feel like leaders make a difference. And
hmm
all the failures of the world and the successes of the world can be attributed to leaders, even though that may or may not be true. Who knows, right? Um, so that's one kind of construct out there.
hmm
We know kind of what it looks like. We may have some models of what's an ideal leader. And then there's this idea of public service motivation, which I know that you asked a question about what exactly this means.
hmm
It's this idea that has been around for, I would say, maybe in some form, the past 50 years or maybe even longer, but it was formalized about a bit more than 30 years ago. And the idea is that individuals that join public service or socially minded organizations have a unique motivation. So if I go work for a marketing organization or go trade stocks on Wall Street, my motivation might be different from someone who joins a nonprofit or who joins government or does something similarly kind of altruistic. So that was the idea, to kind of explore um, why people choose to work in government specifically, but it's expanded to cover other sort of socially minded sectors.
Okay.
And the idea is that people choose these organizations to work for because they have this altruistic, other-minded motivation.
hmm
Some call it pro-social motivation, some call it public service motivation. I mean, for the purposes of being very simple, they're basically the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the systematic synthesis is the study. It kind of refers to your mode of attacking this problem. Is that right?
Yes. So these two constructs are floating around. Many people have examined them. Does being a good leader, does that make people more motivated towards the social mission, or does being publicly minded make you a better leader? There's like all this research.
hmm
So having all these individual pieces of research is good, but in order to be useful, we have to kind of combine it all and give the big picture of what this disparate research tells us.
hmm
So that's the synthesis part of it. So we find 39 studies and we analyze them because they fit our search criteria. And we go through them and try to figure out what's the big picture that they're trying to give us
hmm
in terms of a large scale finding.
hmm
And the mode of research, like you said, was a research synthesis, which has become much more common in the past 10, 20 years of synthesizing a large pool of research to make it more useful.
hmm Well, then, before we get into your findings and everything, what inspired you to do this study in the first place?
Well, so I actually found someone connected me with my co-author Trent Engbers, and he was interested in submitting this to a proposal for a conference on public service motivation.
hmm
And he's been doing work on leadership, and he was really interested in what what makes people, what connects public service motivation to leadership.
Mhm.
So through that conference paper, this paper kind of got written, but then that form of that paper was quite basic, you know. But we ended up finding a good journal that would accept it, and they went through a review process. But really, it's about motivation and leadership, two like extremely important constructs, especially when, you know, there's belt tightening. You can't just pay people bonuses, right, to keep them
Mhm.
motivated. You have to find other ways to do it.
Mhm.
There's austerity measures, COVID-19, so many other things that make motivation very, very difficult to achieve and
Mhm.
sustain. So that's kind of the genesis of the study. So it took us about 2 years, I think, from start to finish to
Okay.
get this out. And I'm very happy it's it's
Mhm.
finally
Yeah.
published.
Well, before I ask you about the organizations that could benefit, I'm going to skip ahead because when you talk about public service motivation, uh, it seems kind of a bit self-evident, right? That people who would go into that line of work would have some sort of altruistic motivation or some motivation separate from the pure profit motive, since there's more profitable sectors to go into. But as a area of study, this whole concept of public service motivation, can you break it down for us a little bit more? Is it how was it established as an idea in the first place, and how does it help people, you know, apply learnings to this sector?
Yeah, so two very simple ways in terms of application. So probably it's evident from what I've said earlier is that the organizations that benefits the most are those that have a social function or public service function, right? So government, nonprofit, public social enterprise, this kind of thing.
Mhm.
So recruitment, right? You're
Okay.
trying to recruit people, you know that you can't be competitive in terms of economic, in terms of wages. So you have to inspire people through mission match.
Mhm.
And that starts from the recruitment of individuals into the organization. Because if you have people already in there and you're trying to change their motivation, that's hard to achieve. But if you
Mhm.
get the right people from the get-go, there you have it, right?
Mhm.
The second part is actual motivation within the organization, right? So when the job gets tough, when the going gets tough, and you don't have the resources to extrinsically motivate people through bonuses or promotions or, you know, all this kind of other businessy type of things that we say are great, you have to find other ways to motivate people to keep them going.
Mhm.
You have to tell them that we're serving a very important function
Mhm.
and inculcate a public service ethic. And that doesn't come automatically. That's where the leaders come in, right?
Okay.
That's when the supervisors come in. They have to model those behaviors and those actions and those values.
Mhm.
That's when you actually see changes.
Okay.
Um, so that's two very brief kind of examples.
Mhm.
Larger in the sort of the policy world, right? If you think about the governmental reform, so not really in Singapore, but outside of Singapore context, you think about austerity measures, ways to reform the public service, you know, government is bloated, blah, 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 all these things. A lot of them center around the fact that, oh, we need government to perform better, so we should pay people more. And if they don't perform, we should cut their pay. And,
Mhm.
you know, it sounds very simple,
Mhm.
but it is very simplistic, actually. And it
Mhm.
might backfire because even experimental evidence shows that when you dangle a big reward in front of people, they usually get distracted from the actual task that they're completing.
Mhm.
Especially if it's a complex task that requires a lot of cognitive skill. If it's
Mhm.
a routine task, then sure,
Mhm.
those things may make them work much faster, right? Increase the rate at which they work.
Mhm.
But for complex kind of social things, right, this stuff kind of backfires. And so much of governmental reform is centered around this idea of paying people for performance,
Mhm.
when performance is not a dollar figure,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
It's not stock market price, it's not profits. You
Mhm.
can't measure that in the
Yeah.
public sector. So that's what makes public service motivation such an intriguing construct,
Mhm.
and the really links it to leadership.
Mhm. And then one of the key questions you were trying to answer is, does leadership influence public service motivation? or is public service motivation a factor in predicting leadership behaviors? So did you find an answer to that question?
Well, not conclusively,
Mm-hmm.
because we only have 39 studies that we found that examine this relationship between these two. But in general, it's much easier to predict that leadership will affect public service motivation,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very practical finding. When
Okay,
you
right.
know that leadership is linked to better job performance, retention, just general satisfaction with the job itself,
Mm-hmm.
then leaders can actually do things to increase their own public service motivation, and especially those of the people that they manage, the lead.
Mm-hmm.
The other way around, we found one or two studies, but to be honest, it's quite low to be able to say conclusively.
Mm-hmm.
Even the leadership affecting public service motivation, we don't really have much causal evidence. We have association, correlation, evidence. It's very difficult to get causal research in social
Mm-hmm.
science, as
Mm-hmm.
you might imagine, because we don't have rats in a lab, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That we can give half of them this, half of them something else,
Mm-hmm.
and then see the effects.
Mm-hmm.
We're dealing with much more complex kind of situation. But yeah, so that's that. All that being said, leadership does predict public service
Okay.
motivation. Yeah.
Then tell me about the styles of leadership and how did that influence public service motivation?
So we found actually that there was a few very overarching kind of styles of leadership or behaviors, which have been around for a very long time. So one of them is known as transformational leadership. You can just Google it, you'll find like 4 different behaviors. Idealized influence, where people idealize you, you have some sort of big mission. Individual consideration, this is where you give special sort of social support to subordinates, and you consider their needs, emotional, socio-emotional needs. You have motivation, inspirational motivation, which refers to providing a vision, articulating a vision that motivates people to some future state. So we have a crisis right now, and 10 years from now, or 5 years, or next year, we'll have this other nice place we're going to. So that can motivate people to think, oh, okay, we're going there, fine. I'm going to motivate myself to change my behavior so that we can get to that station. And then being intellectually stimulating, right? So not just caring about people's emotional needs, but also, helping them deal with intellectual needs, and providing them work that's interesting. So that's the idea of transformational leadership. Probably, it's one of the most well-known kind of approaches. And we did find that transformational leadership is linked to public service motivation, because it is about these larger ideals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's unsurprising to me. Even public service, right? It's about these ideals of like, oh, serving the community or being socially minded.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much congruent with the ideas of transformational leadership.
Mm-hmm.
The others that we found were some more new kind of approaches. So ethical leadership, this idea that you model ethical behaviors in the workplace. So not just through words, by saying to people, oh, we should really care about ethics, but by actually modeling those behaviors so people can learn from them, right? So
Mm-hmm.
seeing this kind of behavior in practice. That's another one that we found to have an influence on public service motivation.
Mm-hmm.
There are others, but they're quite nascent. There
Okay.
isn't too much work on them.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of informs public service motivation.
Okay. I'm curious now that you've explained that. Did you see a difference, or do you have any insight into the big organizations? Like, I would think if it's a government, say, administrative, it's a government bureaucracy that has a mission to do something in the public sphere versus a NGO or a nonprofit, which is kind of might be even more idealistic and might be set up by like a leader who has a real passion. Does that create like kind of two different styles of organization that play into this public service motivation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's like big structural kind of features,
Mm-hmm.
right? So with those smaller organizations, you have this one person that's driving everything. And the sustainability of that organization is already kind of questionable, right? Because once that person goes, who's going to take over? Will there be succession? Whereas government, you know, it's going to be there, right? Unless there's some revolution and government is overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's going to be there. The structures are formalized. Everything's kind of done there. So that does give rise to a lot of differences in that relationship between public service motivation and leadership. And one of the big things is just size, right?
Okay.
When you have thousands of people working and you have these large scale policies, right, formulated at the top level and trickling down, really have to assess to what extent, you know, the intent behind some change, some managerial change, some leadership change is communicated, right? So one of the big issues in leadership is actually communicating intent, right? Because if you don't communicate intent, people will make up their own minds.
Right.
They may not look, they may assume that you're acting out of your own interests rather than the interests of the people that you lead. So size makes a huge difference. And it's likely that, you know, survival makes a big difference also in that relationship. And lastly, it's probably much more likely that people self-select into these professions in the first place. And that's the whole theory of public service motivation, that people self-select. We're not randomly assigned to jobs, right? So I am motivated to work in the social sector, so I go work for this organization. So likely people already have public service motivation. Then the question becomes, how can you hone that and actually use that, right? Because in a lot of those sectors, people might actually burn out if they don't have enough resources. Right. So that's another part which we don't examine, right? So there's a lot more work on that, especially in professions like teaching. You know, there's quite a lot of burnout. Nursing, right? You could arguably say it's socially minded, right? Public service minded. They don't do it for wages. So that becomes another issue, but we don't really speak to that in the paper.
Okay, but you do talk about the whether or not the relationship between leadership and public service motivation is constant, or if it's contingent on the context, such as you know, what sector it's in, or national context. You touched on that a bit right now, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you found?
So actually, we found very little difference. In fact, no like actually discernible difference. And I would say probably that's due to the limited number of studies.
Okay.
So if there were many studies in the nonprofit sector or across the world, then I would imagine that there are actually differences. But we can't speak to any because of the little number of studies. 39 is quite small. If you have hundreds, then it's easier. But I would predict that it is different. So if you think about just based on structural features, right? So Singapore Public Service, famously, you know, it's unlike other governmental services across the world, the pay is quite good, right? It's very competitive with the private sector. That's to ensure that you keep the best within the organization, they're not lured away, and also to reduce corruption, right? There's rent seeking, this kind of behavior, which is a problem in Southeast Asia, right? So here, you know, public service motivation may play a very different role. So people may not really need to be publicly motivated. They might be. The other possibility is that people actually have these mixes of motivations. You're not purely motivated by public service. You still need to provide food and shelter for your family.
Right.
You still want to buy a nice car and house and all these kinds of things. But there are differences, you know, when you compare just average levels of public service motivation across different sectors, the private sector comes down much lower.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like the research that was conducted about 20 years ago.
Okay.
But yeah, we didn't find a whole lot of differences, but I would imagine there would be.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Asia is one of the regions where there is a lot of research on public service motivation,
Mm-hmm.
especially in China and Korea,
Mm-hmm.
not so much in Singapore. But people do seem to, have this, public service ethic across the world. But we really need to know more.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you say, with the kind of mixed motivations that people have, of course, like in the public sector, there's competition amongst agencies, and right, they're all trying to get the best of the people out there that are self-selected to want to work in that sector. So I guess that brings us to like implications of the findings of your study. How would you expect, organizations in the public sector to use this knowledge, whether it's for their recruitment or their motivation? What can they take away from this to help their organizations run better?
Well, I mean, simply kind of pay attention to people's sort of public service needs,
Mm-hmm.
Especially when things get tough, right? I mean, and people learn from their social environments too, right? So when you link performance to extrinsic pay and all these kinds of things, that's good because it does motivate people. Pay does motivate individuals. But the problem is, to what extent can you sustain that? At some level, the marginal impact of increased pay will be very, very small, so then people actually want to make a difference. So there's a few strategies. So one of them is, and none of these are groundbreaking. They've been things that have been said maybe 50 years ago by people studying job design and all these kinds of things. But the nature of management research is that there's a lot of old wine in new bottles kind of situation. So connecting people to their beneficiaries, seeing the impact of your work, right? Having a sense of identity about what you stand for in your organization, having a public service mission, an organization that you're proud of. That's also very important. And making people aware, that they're valued in the organization. All of these kinds of strategies do make a difference in keeping people around, not just when things are great, but when things go, when the situation gets worse and you aren't able to sustain using extrinsic rewards. Those are general sort of implications. With regards to public service motivation, it would be really about honing the public service mission and vision. And that really comes down to leaders articulating that. So can we say, why is it that we do what we do today? And how does what I'm doing today affect the large picture of whatever the policy is or the outcome? So you may not be able to connect all those threads, and that's where kind of leadership helps articulate those different things. And yeah, that's basically it.
Do you have any examples of good leadership, in when times are hard, or any organizations that have a leader that's been inspiring and, able to kind of implement these sort of ideas?
I mean, transformation leaders have been, there's many examples, right? I mean, probably the ones you can think of, right? People that have gone, risen to the challenge, really articulated a vision, bringing people together. So one could argue, usually they come from geopolitics, right? Because that's stuff people know about, right? So you could think about FDR, right? Roosevelt, even if you don't agree with the policies or all these kinds of things, right? You could say that this person was in the right place at the right time, which is probably very true. And it's really about rising to the challenge, right? So something happens, a great number of people might be able to rise to the challenge and imbibe those behaviors. So the other stuff that we don't go into the leadership literature is really about, are leaders born or made?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that, yeah, you can actually make leaders. You know, there is not some random personality trait that makes someone a better leader or the other, which is good news
Mm-hmm.
for those of us that are introverts and may not
Mm-hmm.
have social skills, right? And
Mm-hmm.
all these kinds of things, right?
Right.
All these things don't matter that much for actual effective leadership. Um, so yeah, the popular examples would be very, very much apt,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in thinking about leaders and motivating people towards public service. Gosh,
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had more. I'm trying to think. Do you, when you read the study, did something come to your mind, or?
Well, one thing that came to mind was just how much there is an overlap with the private sector, because a lot of the big MNCs, they have like a whole CSR model.
Mhm.
They have mission statements and vision statements. And especially over the past 10 or 15 years, I've seen how so many more companies try to have a kind of public service angle
Yep.
to what their profit making, enterprise is. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And you see like business leaders in a way trying to take this kind of steps, these leadership steps.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and this is for the same reason, right? So when you do CSR activities, people tend, you know, as employees, we feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, we're doing something good. You know, it
Mm-hmm.
gives you a chance to bond also
Mm-hmm.
outside of the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
see people in a more human light, and connect yourself to beneficiaries. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, so I think, yeah, and this is becoming a lot more common, especially with, if you think about the larger context within which corporations are responding to social pressures and
Yes. Uh-huh.
trends,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, to their detriment or to their benefit, you know, depending on who the audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And all this stuff will kind of continue. Some of it is window dressing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it, you know, if you take a very cynical view, it's really trying to squeeze out as much from an employee as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, it's not that.
Mm-hmm.
It is an intentional effort to actually connect to the wider community and do something good for the community that, you know, you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but a lot of times, you know, it can just be like a, if it's not a priority by leadership, it's just an office of CSR that's really kind of a in the basement office somewhere, doesn't really get much resources or attention.
Mm-hmm.
Then, you know, people might not take that seriously as well. So it's the
Right.
job of leaders to actually make that a priority.
Absolutely.
And if they don't, then, you know, people see through that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think eventually over time that, you know, there's, so many articles about greenwashing, companies that try to portray a green image, but
Right.
if
Eco labeling.
essentially, yeah, they're not really making a huge difference across the board.
Yeah.
I just,
Because they're trying to
oh,
cater to a socially minded consumer
mm-hmm,
and give off all these things.
mm-hmm,
So even if you think about, but there are some that are very interesting. So the CEO of Microsoft, I think it's Venkat Nadella. I think he has a son
Satya,
with.
Satya Nadella, right?
Oh, right. I think,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
And he has a son with a learning disability. So I
Mm-hmm,
think either this was it, or I think this prompted them to have an autism hiring program.
mm-hmm, yes.
So
Mm-hmm,
Microsoft has a dedicated autism hiring program
mm-hmm,
where they specifically seek out individuals with autism.
mm-hmm,
And there's many other corporations that have started doing so. SAP, the
mm-hmm,
German corporation, they also have these initiatives that are, uh, you know, they serve both functions, right? We're not purely bad or good.
mm-hmm,
Obviously, we want to take advantage of people that have such cognitive skills, but
mm-hmm,
they don't fare well in the traditional interview
right.
because of social skills and all these kinds of
Mm-hmm,
things. But we also want to tell people like, hey, uh, disability diversity matters,
mm-hmm,
right? These are still people, good people, and they deserve to have an equal opportunity and to have a decent life where they're
mm-hmm,
self-sufficient. Um, so, yeah, hopefully it's more of the latter than just the cynical kind of take.
right.
But it's good to be critical consumer also.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, one last thing I'd like to ask you before we wrap this up, because you mentioned several times that 39 studies is not much, and there's a lot of things you would still like to know. What are some things that if you could, if you had all the time and money in the world, what would your next study be? What are some of the things you would want to find out?
Oh, I mean, it's very simple. The next step would be to do actually a meta-analysis, which is so our study was qualitative, so there was very few numbers. I think if you probably have seen. So
Mhm.
meta-analysis actually gives you numbers, tells you how much of an increase in quantitative terms would leadership cause
Mhm.
on public service motivation. Um, so I don't have the you see all these papers here, right? This is all
Yeah.
the stuff I'm working on. There's a
Mhm.
long list also on the board.
Yeah. Mhm.
So hopefully when those things get cleared up, I hope to be able to conduct that. It would require a lot of time, but
Mhm.
also be able to, conduct some primary studies where
Right.
you actually examine the relationship between these two in a context that has been maybe understudied, right? So Africa, South Asia, uh, you get a lot of studies from East Asia,
Mhm.
from Europe, and from North America.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of regions that are very much underrepresented, and we don't know how leadership actually, functions there.
Mhm.
And because of all the reasons that we talked about today, leadership matters. It's an
Mhm.
important kind of thing. So yeah, lots of things to figure out. And also, if I actually was, in this God scenario, I would try
Mhm.
to figure out causality.
Mhm.
How does it go?
Mhm.
But much more challenging said than done. So
Right. Exactly.
yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention?
No, I would just encourage people to go read the paper,
Mhm.
watch this interview,
Mhm.
podcast, and contact me if they have questions. Happy to talk. And if there's any people working in public sector organizations or social-minded organizations, I'd love
Mhm.
to hear from them too. So
Okay.
and see how they're doing. Yeah,
Very good. A call
yeah,
to action. They can reach out to Professor
yeah.
Taha if they have anything to add to the conversation.
Yes, yes, sure. All
Wonderful.
right.
Okay. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much, David. Take
Okay.
care.
You
It was
too.
very nice talking to you.